The man looked at her hand like it was a mistake. That is the only way to describe it. Not a pause, not distraction, not a fumbled moment of social uncertainty. He looked at her extended hand, held in the practiced professional gesture of someone who had opened hundreds of meetings this way, and he turned away. Deliberately, fully. His back completing the pivot before she had time to register that it had begun. Her name was Celeste Okafor. She was standing in the open doorway of the conference room on the 14th floor of Haddon Tower, dressed in the crisp charcoal blazer she kept on a separate hanger at the back of her office closet. The same blazer her grandmother had said looked like authority. The clipboard in her other hand held the day's agenda, 2 columns of line items organized by building zone, each one initialed in her neat, controlled cursive. She'd been doing this job for 11 years. She had signed off on more renovation work than most people in that building had ever commissioned. She had stood in doorways exactly like this one, extended her hand exactly like this, introduced herself exactly like this, 1,000 times. Marcus Holt had not taken her hand, and now 37 people in that room had watched it happen. Before we get to what followed, before we get to the moment Marcus Holt sat in that same room on a Monday morning weeks later and learned in precise contractual language exactly whose signature authorized every dollar his company was owed, let me take you back. Because what you need to understand about Celeste Okafor is not just what she knew and not just what she had built in 11 years of near-invisible, relentless work. What you need to understand is where she had come from and what she had been taught and why none of what happened in that conference room surprised her at all. Celeste's grandmother, Adaize, had come to the United States from Enugu, Nigeria in the autumn of 1971, carrying 2 suitcases, $12 in folded bills, and a philosophy about work that she had delivered to every member of her family with the calm, irresistible precision of a person who had witnessed too much to be argued with. The philosophy had no name. It was not written anywhere. It arrived across kitchen tables and in the back seats of old cars and standing at ironing boards, delivered in the same tone Adaize used for everything. Quiet and permanent and warm. It went like this. The people who underestimate you are doing you a favor, and the people who recognize you are doing themselves one. Your job is simply to remain the same person regardless of which situation you find yourself in. Build the thing. Be the thing. Let the record speak. Adaize had cleaned offices for 17 years before she had enough saved to open a small janitorial supply company, which she had then grown over 2 decades into a regional facilities management contractor with 42 employees and a client list that included 3 hospital systems and a university campus. She had done it without a degree, without a business school connection, without a single mentor who had opened a door for her. She had built it from the inside of the rooms nobody noticed, by learning everything that happened in those rooms, by becoming someone those rooms could not afford to replace. She died in June of 2009 when Celeste was 26 years old, and she left the company to Celeste, and a sealed envelope Celeste was instructed not to open until she had been running the business alone for at least a full calendar year. Celeste ran the business alone for 11 months before she opened the envelope, which was close enough. Inside was one sentence, handwritten in her grandmother's slanted, deliberate script: "The room will always underestimate the person who learned it from the floor up." Celeste had the sentence framed. It hung in the back office that nobody visited, directly behind the desk where she sat to sign contracts. She had been thinking about that sentence all morning before she walked into Haddon Tower. Here is what those 11 months, and then the 11 years that followed, actually looked like. Celeste had worked in her grandmother's company since she was 16, starting in the supply warehouse, counting and restocking inventory on weekends before school on Monday. She had spent summers on crews, learning the physical logic of a building from its lowest systems upward. She knew what a HVAC intake looked like from the inside of a mechanical room. She knew the difference between a structural load-bearing column and a cosmetic partition wall. She knew how to read a construction schedule and how long any given task actually took versus how long it was billed for. Adaize had made sure of it, not through lectures, but through proximity. If you spent enough time in the rooms nobody noticed, you learned their grammar. After her grandmother's death, the first year was the education Adaize had calculated for her. Not grief management, not transition support, education. The contracts her grandmother had built did not renew themselves. Client relationships needed tending. Suppliers needed renegotiating. The two long-tenured supervisors her grandmother had trusted with daily operations had their own ideas about how things should run under new management. One of those ideas involved Celeste being more of a figurehead and less of a director. She was 26 years old. She did not have grey in her hair or a degree on her wall or a title that anyone outside the company recognized. She had 11 years of warehouse and crew knowledge, 2 summers of bookkeeping courses she had taken at the community college while her grandmother was still alive, and a very precise understanding of what the company's numbers actually meant. She corrected the impression in the 3rd month, quietly, with 2 changes to the reporting structure and a renegotiated materials contract that saved the company 11% annually. The supervisors adjusted. The clients stayed. By the end of year 3, she had added 4 new commercial clients and opened a second operations center. By year 7, she had replaced a third of her equipment fleet and hired her first dedicated compliance officer. Not because she had been told to, because she had read in the trade publications she subscribed to with her own money that the commercial renovation space was moving toward more rigorous documentation standards, and she intended to be ahead of it when it arrived. She was thinking about that compliance officer and about those 7 years of preparation when she submitted the Haddon Tower bid. The Haddon Tower renovation contract was the largest single project in her company's history. Okafor Facilities Management had been in the running for 14 months, through 3 rounds of competitive bidding and 2 third-party audits. The contract covered 4 floors of complete infrastructure renovation, plus coordination management across 18 subcontractor relationships, totaling just over $4 million of scheduled work over a 22-month timeline. It was the kind of contract that would move her company from regional player to a seat at tables she had been standing outside of for years. She had submitted her final bid with her grandmother's posture, quiet and accurate and complete. The bid package had taken 11 weeks to assemble. Celeste had done most of the work herself, not because she lacked staff, but because she needed every number to be exact and every projection to be defensible. She had walked all 4 Haddon Tower floors twice before drafting the coordination plan, mapping the access corridors, the freight elevator windows, the noise-sensitive zones near occupied tenant suites. She had interviewed 6 of the likely subcontractors informally before any formal process to understand their actual operational rhythms, rather than their bid sheet promises. She had priced the coordination layer not as a percentage markup but as a built-out cost model, line by line, so that when the Haddon Tower Procurement Committee asked questions, she had answers that did not come from a formula. She won the bid 6 weeks before the day Marcus Holt refused her handshake. Marcus Holt ran Holt Structural & Sons, a mid-sized commercial contracting firm based out of 2 counties over. His company had been doing structural work in and around Haddon Tower for 7 years. He was one of the 18 subcontractors whose work would now flow through Celeste's coordination and authorization system. He had received the formal notification of the contract award, the project structure, and the name of the coordination manager, Celeste D. Okafor, 3 weeks prior to that morning's kickoff meeting. His project manager had acknowledged receipt. His company logo was printed on the laminated subcontractor roster on the conference table. He simply had not, apparently, read any of it closely enough to understand who he was walking into a room to meet. She had seen it before. Not always the turn back, not always that particular form, but the underlying thing. The assumption that the woman standing at the door in the charcoal blazer with the clipboard must be someone's assistant, someone's scheduler, someone organizing the coffee order. She had developed a way of holding her face that gave nothing away in those moments. Adias had taught her that too, though less explicitly. She had learned it by watching her grandmother respond to every slight with the same expression, steady as a clock face, not cold, not warm, simply present and unreachable. Celeste lowered her hand. She stepped into the room and introduced herself to the group. "Good morning," she said, placing the clipboard on the table at the head position she had reserved for herself. "I'm Celeste Okafor, Project Coordination Director at Okafor Facilities. Welcome to the Haddon Tower Phase 1 kickoff. We have a lot of ground to cover this morning, so I'll get us started." Marcus Holt had moved to a chair along the far wall, the position of someone who did not expect to be asked many questions. He was wrong about that. She ran the meeting for an hour and 40 minutes. 18 subcontractor representatives sat around and along the walls of that room, from electrical contractors to HVAC specialists to the elevator modernization firm that had flown in their regional director for the kickoff. She covered project phasing, access windows, materials delivery protocols, and the authorization chain for change orders. She explained the consequence structure for schedule slippage with specificity, which delays triggered a formal notice, which triggered a financial penalty, which triggered a subcontractor review by the coordination office in consultation with property management. She presented the communication matrix she had built over 3 weeks of preliminary calls, naming each firm's designated point of contact and their escalation path. She introduced her compliance officer, a composed woman named Nadia, who would be the day-to-day contact for documentation questions. When she reached the section on coordination fees and invoice routing, she walked the room through the payment authorization structure with the same unhurried precision she used for everything. Every invoice, she explained, for every subcontractor on the project would route through her office for technical compliance review before being forwarded to Haddon Tower's accounts payable department for release. Her signature on the coordination sign-off was the trigger for payment processing. Not a secondary approval, not a courtesy copy. The trigger. She let that word land for a moment, the way a good teacher lets an important phrase settle before moving on. The regional director from the elevator firm leaned forward and asked a question about the submission portal. Celeste answered it directly, then opened to the group for 30 minutes of structured questions, moving through the room with the control of someone who had anticipated every concern before the meeting began, because she had. She had prepared a written FAQ document that addressed the 9 most common questions she had encountered across the preliminary calls. She distributed it at the question period, so that people were reading the answers as she spoke them. A few people around the table shifted slightly when the payment trigger was explained a second time, in the FAQ document's language. The kind of shift that happens when a person recalibrates something they had assumed. Marcus Holt had not shifted. He was looking at his phone. His site supervisor, a compact man named Roy, seated to Holt's left, had been paying careful attention since minute 12 of the meeting. Celeste had noticed him. She noticed everyone who was paying attention and everyone who was not. She noticed the elevator director's careful notation in the margin of the FAQ document. She noticed the HVAC contractor who spent 10 minutes after the access schedule presentation checking his own firm's calendar on a tablet. She noticed the 3 men in the back row who had the posture of people who had decided this meeting was not relevant to them, and she made a private note to ensure their firms received the compliance training summary first. The meeting ended at 11:52. People gathered their folders and began moving toward the exit in the loosely organized way of a large group dispersing after a long session. Roy caught Celeste near the projection screen, offered his hand immediately, and with both sincerity and a certain deliberate energy, the kind of handshake that was also an acknowledgement of something he could not directly name. "Roy Mathers," he said, "I want to say that was one of the most well-prepared kick-off meetings I've attended in this industry. Your coordination matrix alone would have taken my office 2 months to build." "Thank you, Roy," Celeste said. "I look forward to working with your team." Marcus Holt left the room without looking at her. Here is what you need to understand about what happens next. Celeste did not go to her car and sit with her jaw tight and her hands gripping the wheel. She did not call her operations manager to describe the moment. She did not replay Marcus Holt's turn back in the movie theatre of her mind on the drive back to her office. She returned to her desk, ate the lunch she had packed that morning, and opened the project folder she had been working in since 7 a.m. There were 23 items on her action list for the afternoon. She completed 18 of them before she left for the day. This is what a daze had meant by the phrase that Celeste had memorized and never spoken aloud. You do not give your peace to people who have not earned it. The project began in earnest 2 weeks later. Celeste's office ran with a precision that the Haddon Tower property management team noticed within the first 30 days. Her coordination logs were detailed and time-stamped. Her change order responses came back within the required window every time. Her site access scheduling had an error rate of essentially 0. Nadia had the compliance documentation system running at full function before the end of the 3rd week, a full week ahead of the projected implementation date. The Haddon Tower project director, a careful, methodical woman named Sylvia Estes, told her own supervisor at the 6-week mark that Okafor Facilities had been the correct choice and that she wanted it documented in the quarterly performance file. Holt Structural's invoices arrived on schedule. Celeste reviewed them with the same methodical attention she gave to every document. In week 7, she flagged a materials billing line that exceeded the approved scope by $11,000 without an accompanying change order. She sent a standard compliance notice to Roy Mathers, who responded the same day with an apology and the correct documentation. The invoice was processed the following week. In week 11, a second billing discrepancy arrived. This one was larger, $26,000 attached to a labour reclassification that had not been submitted through the change order system. Celeste pulled up the contract specifications, the original scope document, and the relevant section of the coordination agreement. She sent the compliance notice to Roy again, this time with the specific contract clauses cited by section number. Roy responded promptly. But this time, the response also included a call from Marcus Holt. She took the call at her desk, on speaker, with the project folder open in front of her. "I understand there's a billing hold on our Week 11 invoice," Marcus said. His voice had the particular quality of a man who expected inconveniences to dissolve when he spoke firmly enough. "My office is saying it's coming from your end. I need that cleared up today." "Mr. Holt," Celeste said, her voice at its normal register, steady and unhurried. "The hold is a compliance matter. Your invoice includes $26,000 in labour reclassification charges that weren't submitted through the change order process. That's a requirement of the coordination agreement which your company signed in week 1. I can send you the relevant section if that would be helpful." There was a brief pause. "We've been doing structural work in this building for 7 years. I know what the billing process looks like." "The billing process for work coordinated through this office follows the coordination agreement," Celeste said. "The documentation requirement isn't optional. If you submit the change order form with the supporting labour hours, I'll turn the review around within our standard window." Another pause, longer this time. "Who's above you on this project?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Celeste let it settle for one full second before she answered. "For coordination authorization, I am the relevant party," she said. "If you'd like to discuss the matter with Haddon Towers' property management team, you're welcome to contact Sylvia Estes directly. Her office will refer you back to the coordination agreement." She paused. "I'll expect the change order documentation by end of business Friday." She ended the call and returned to her action list. Nadia appeared in her doorway 3 minutes later with the coordination agreement open to section 4. She had been listening from her desk. She looked at Celeste with a question in her expression that was not actually a question. "It goes through the process," Celeste said. "Same as everything else." Nadia nodded and went back to her desk. Marcus Holt submitted the change order documentation the following Thursday, 1 day ahead of her deadline. It was complete and in the correct format. She processed the invoice the next morning. This was, in the way these things go, the point at which a lesser man might have decided to be more careful. Marcus Holt was not that man. The real trouble began in week 15, when Celeste received a call from Sylvia Estes at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning. Sylvia's voice had the particular compression of a person controlling something they did not want to show. "I've had a meeting request this morning," Sylvia said, "from Marcus Holt. He's asked to sit down with me and the Haddon Tower Board liaison to discuss, and I'm reading from his email now, ongoing operational friction in the coordination layer that is creating unnecessary cost burden on subcontractors." He's attached a document. "What does the document say?" Celeste asked. "It's a list of what he's describing as delays and compliance overreach. He's cited 4 invoices. He's characterized the change order documentation requirements as, and again I'm reading, inconsistent with standard industry practice and potentially punitive in application." Celeste opened her project folder. She knew which 4 invoices were on that list before Sylvia finished reading them aloud. She had reviewed every one. She had reviewed every invoice from every one of the 18 subcontractors, every flag she had issued, every compliance notice, every response, every turnaround time. The records were not in her head as a general impression. They were in her head as numbers because she had always worked that way, the way her grandmother had taught her to work. Not from feeling, from fact. She kept her voice at its normal register when she spoke. Not brisk, not demonstrably calm in the way of someone performing calm. Just itself, the voice of a person who had already done the work and was now simply reporting on it. "Sylvia," she said, "I can have a full compliance record for each of those invoices on your desk within the hour. Timeline, documentation submitted, documentation required, turnaround time, payment date, all 4. It took 43 minutes. Celeste built the summary at her desk, pulling each record from the coordination log without referencing anything she did not already know. 6 pages, every invoice, every flag, every response from Holt's office, every turnaround time measured in days against the contractual standard, every payment release date. She formatted it the way she formatted all formal documentation. Clean columns, labeled clearly, no commentary, no argument, just the record. She drove it to Sylvia's building and placed it on her desk in person. The average review to release time on all 4 flagged invoices was 4 days. The contractual standard was 7. Sylvia read through the summary twice. Then she looked up and said, "Do you want to be in the room when I respond to Mr. Holt's meeting request?" "Only if you feel my presence would be useful," Celeste said. "The record speaks for itself." Sylvia scheduled the meeting for the following Monday. It was held in the same conference room on the 14th floor. Same long table, same windows, same carpet with its pattern of interlocking diamonds in charcoal and ivory. 3 weeks had changed exactly nothing about that room, except who occupied which chair at the head of it. Celeste sat at the head. She had arrived 12 minutes before the meeting time, set out her documentation, and arranged the room copy of the coordination agreement with the relevant sections tabbed. Not aggressively, not theatrically. The way a person arranges a room when they know exactly what will be needed and exactly when. She had placed a single copy of the 6-page compliance summary at each seat. She had placed a glass of water at each position. Small gestures. The gestures of a host. Nobody had noticed that Marcus Holt had also been invited to this room once before, in a different posture, by a different host. Nobody except Celeste. She had not arranged the room for symmetry or irony. She had arranged it because she ran meetings this way. Always. And because the record she was about to present deserved a room that treated it with the same precision it contained. Marcus Holt arrived with his project manager, a younger man named Todd, who had the look of someone who had been told only part of the story and was beginning to suspect it was the less accurate part. The Haddon Tower Board liaison, a deliberate and unhurried man named Walter Chen, sat to Sylvia's right with a yellow legal pad and a pen he did not uncap for the first 20 minutes. Sylvia opened by thanking both parties for their time and announcing that the purpose of the meeting was to review Mr. Holt's concern letter and the Coordination Office's response documentation. She placed both documents on the table with the care of someone who intended them to be read carefully. Marcus Holt began speaking before anyone had finished reading. "I want to be clear," he said, "that I've been working at this level of commercial contracting for 19 years. The documentation burden this office is placing on subcontractors is not standard. It's costing my company time and money on a project where our margins are already tight. I asked for this meeting because someone needs to take a serious look at whether the coordination structure on this project is working." He had not looked directly at Celeste since entering the room. Walter Chen uncapped his pen. Sylvia indicated the response summary. "Mr. Holt, I've reviewed the coordination records for each invoice you cited in your letter. The average review and release time across all 4 was 4 days against a contractual standard of 7. Could you help me understand specifically where the delay occurred?" A quiet settled over the room. Marcus Holt looked at the document for the first time. Todd, his project manager, looked at it too. Todd's expression shifted in a way that Marcus Holt's did not. "These numbers reflect time from receipt of compliant documentation," Todd said quietly, to no one in particular. "That's correct," Celeste said. "The clock for our review window begins when compliant documentation is received. 2 of the 4 invoices required a compliance notice and resubmission before they entered the review queue." There was a long pause. Marcus Holt's jaw moved once, a small, precise motion, and then stopped. "So the issue," Walter Chen said, still writing, "is the resubmission requirement." "The documentation requirements are specified in the coordination agreement," Celeste said. "Section 4, subsection 3, with supporting detail in the compliance annex. Every subcontractor received the full agreement at contract execution. My office sent a compliance training summary to all 18 firms in week 2 of the project." Todd had found the coordination agreement in his own folder. He was reading it. His expression was the expression of a man arriving at a conclusion his employer had not prepared him for. Walter Chen wrote something and then said, without looking up, "Mr. Holt, Do you have any documentation indicating that the compliance requirements you received differed from those in Ms. Okafor's summary? The room waited. No, Marcus Holt said, one word without inflection. The voice of a man who had just understood, fully, what room he was actually sitting in and who was running it. The meeting lasted 11 more minutes. Walter Chen asked 3 additional questions, each of which Celeste answered from the documentation in front of her without referencing notes. Sylvia formally noted that the Coordination Office's records indicated full compliance with contractual standards. The concern letter was, in Walter Chen's precise language, resolved in favour of the existing coordination structure. Marcus Holt and Todd left the room without speaking. At the door, Walter Chen paused and turned back to Celeste. He was holding his legal pad with both hands in the manner of a man who had decided something. "Ms. Okafor," he said, "I want to say on behalf of the Board Liaison Office that your documentation practices on this project are among the best I have encountered in this building in 11 years. I'll be putting that in writing." "Thank you, Mr. Chen," Celeste said. "I appreciate that." She gathered her folder, straightened her chair, and walked out into the corridor. The corridor on the 14th floor of Haddon Tower was long and narrow, finished in pale marble that reflected the overhead fixtures back up at itself in a continuous stripe of light. Celeste had walked this corridor a dozen times in the course of the project. She had walked it carrying clipboard and site reports, and once a rolled set of floor plans that would not fit in her bag. She had walked it in the charcoal blazer and once in a hard hat after a site visit. She knew the sound her shoes made on the marble, a crisp, unhurried contact that did not vary in pace regardless of what she was walking toward or away from. She had noticed early on that she was always the only person of colour in the corridor. She had filed that observation in the same place she filed all observations of that kind, in the part of her attention that registered and moved on, that did not ruminate and did not perform. She walked the corridor now at her normal pace, folder under her arm. In her office that evening, after the rest of her staff had gone home, she sat at her grandmother's desk in the back room and allowed herself one quiet moment with the frame on the wall. Not triumph, not the particular thrill of watching someone made small who had made her small, just the still, durable satisfaction of a record that had spoken exactly as she had always known it would. The room had not given her power. It had simply, finally, stopped blocking the door. Blocking. Here is what happened in the 31 days that followed that meeting. Holt Structural completed their next 3 billing cycles without a single compliance flag. Roy Mathers began sending advanced documentation packages 10 days ahead of each invoice. Clean, complete, organised in exactly the format Celeste's office required. He sent a brief professional note with the 3rd package that said only that they appreciated the precision of her system. "It makes our work better too," he wrote. Celeste forwarded the note to her operations file and said nothing about it to anyone. Walter Chen's written commendation arrived in Celeste's office 12 days after the meeting, printed on Haddon Tower Board letterhead, signed by Chen and countersigned by the building's general managing director. It cited the Coordination Office's documentation practices, response times, and change order management as exemplary. It was placed in the permanent project file and copied to Okafor Facilities Management's client record at Haddon Tower. Sylvia Estes called on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the meeting to tell Celeste that the board had approved an early addition to the contract. Phase 2, which had originally been penciled in as a post-completion option, was being formally authorised at the end of the month. The expanded scope added another $1.6 million to the project total. The coordination structure would remain unchanged. Celeste wrote the number in the project folder, under the line that held the original $4 million. She calculated the revised total without a calculator and wrote it cleanly in the margin, $5,600,000. All of it routed through her authorization, all of it bearing her signature before it moved anywhere. She thought about her grandmother's 42 employees and the regional client list built from the inside of rooms nobody noticed. She thought about the handshake Marcus Holt had declined to take. She did not feel angry. She never had, not exactly. What she felt was the quiet, accumulated weight of being correct for a very long time in rooms that had not yet noticed, and then the particular release of a room that finally had. The week the Phase 2 contract was executed, Roy Mathers called to request a brief coordination meeting. the kind of routine check-in that happened naturally between a general coordination office and its largest active subcontractor. Celeste put it on the calendar for a Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon, same conference room, 14th floor. Roy arrived 3 minutes early. He was alone. They covered the Phase 2 scope extension, the revised access schedule, and 2 materials delivery windows that would need adjustment given the expanded timeline. Roy had already drafted proposed solutions to both. His preparation, as it always was now, was thorough and clean. Near the end of the meeting, Roy set down his pen. "Ms. Okafor," he said, "I want to say something that's maybe outside the scope of what we're here to discuss." He looked at the table for a moment, then back up. "The way you ran that first meeting, and then handled the billing issues, and then handled the concern letter. I've watched a lot of project managers work at this level. I've never seen someone do it that cleanly." A pause. "I wanted you to know I see it. And I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner." Celeste looked at him steadily, not warmly, not coolly, with the full attention of someone who understood exactly what it had cost him to say it. "Thank you, Roy," she said. "That means something." She meant it, not because she needed it and not because it changed anything about the record, which had already spoken. She meant it because Roy Mathers had chosen, in a small and private way, to be the person who did not look away. And that choice, made quietly at a conference table with no audience and no institutional consequence, was its own kind of thing. Not rare enough in the world, not common enough either. Roy picked up his pen and they returned to the Phase 2 access schedule. The question of what happened to Marcus Holt in the weeks after the board meeting is not a dramatic story. There was no confrontation, no public accounting, no scene. What happened was quieter than that and, in the long run, more durable. Holt Structural completed their contracted scope on the original project timeline without incident. When the Phase 2 subcontractor roster was drawn up by Celeste's office in consultation with Sylvia Estes and the board liaison, Holt Structural received a reduced scope allocation. 1 floor instead of 2. The reallocation was handled through the standard bid process, documented in the project record, and communicated by Sylvia's office in the same professional, measured language the project used for everything. Marcus Holt did not call Celeste's office to discuss it. He submitted his revised scope confirmation through Roy, who submitted it through the proper channel on time, in the correct format, without a compliance flag. That was the consequence. Not a firing, not a confrontation, not a scene anyone could point to as a reckoning, just the precise institutional logic of a record applied consistently by the person who had built it, the same person whose hand he had declined to shake in a doorway 4 months earlier in front of 37 witnesses who had watched the whole thing and understood exactly what it meant. By the time the project entered its final quarter, Celeste's company had 2 new bids pending at commercial properties she had not been able to reach before Haddon Tower. Her project coordinator had been promoted to operations lead. She had hired 2 additional site supervisors and a dedicated change order specialist. The back office had been repainted. Her grandmother's framed sentence had been moved from behind the desk to beside the door, so it was the last thing Celeste saw every time she left. The room will always underestimate the person who learned it from the floor up. There is a number worth knowing, though it will not surprise you. In the United States, black women own approximately 1.6 million businesses. They represent the fastest growing segment of women business owners in the country, and they secure, on average, less than 1% of commercial contracting dollars. That gap is not a mystery. It is the aggregate consequence of 1,000 decisions made in 1,000 conference rooms by people who looked at the hand being offered and turned away. Celeste Okafor's grandmother understood that gap before it was studied or named. She built her answer to it in 42 employees and a client list and a sealed envelope and a sentence that her granddaughter had hung beside a door. The people who underestimate you are doing you a favor. The people who recognize you are doing themselves one. If you have ever stood in a doorway with your hand out and watched someone look through you like you were not there, you know what Celeste carried into every room she walked into. And if you have ever refused to let that moment change your posture, refused to let it make you smaller or louder or anything other than exactly yourself, then you already know what the record sounds like when it finally speaks. You know exactly what it sounds like. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who has ever had to be the most prepared person in the room just to be taken seriously in it. That is the person this story was built for.